Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo, founding partner at Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency advisory firm that's focused on addressing complex development challenges across the continent. Liberal democracy should be the final stage in political evolution, if we listen to Francis Fukuyama. Yet over the years, whilst many countries have taken to elections, democracy, which should be government of the people, by the people, for the people, has at best stagnated, but could be receding, not just in Africa, but across the world. In their engaging and intensely provocative book, How to Rig an Election, Nic Cheeseman and Brian Klaas discussed the limitations of national elections as a means of promoting democratization and revealed 6 essential strategies dictators and autocrats.
I lost you for a moment, but you're back. I'm not sure whose end it was on, I'm afraid, but let's keep going. We're back now. I can see you, you can see me. It's all good.
Excellent, excellent. So Nic Cheeseman is a professor of democracy at the University of Birmingham and founding editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of African Politics. He has authored more than 10 books focusing on democracy, elections, and development. Articles based on his research have won several prizes, including the Giga Award for the best article in comparative area studies in 2013, and the Frank Cass Award for the best article in democratization 2015. His book, How to Rig an Election, which we're discussing or are going to use as a context for our discussions today, was selected as one of the best books of the year by Spectator magazine. In recognition of his academic and public contributions, the Political Studies Association of the United Kingdom awarded him the prestigious Johnny Lewandowski Prize for outstanding professional achievement. In recent years, he has also won the Celebrating Impact Prize of the Economic and Social Research Council for outstanding international impact and the Josiah Mason Award for academic advancement. Nic is a frequent contributor on democracy, elections, and global events, and appears often in The Economist, Le Monde, Financial Times, Washington Post, New York Times, etc., and a regular column for the Africa Report and the Mail and Guardian. You can find more of his thoughts on democracyinafrica.org, which he founded and co-edits. Nic, welcome.
It's a real pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Now, starting from just the question that's top of mind for many people, why should we as Africans continue to be bothered with democracy if it is so fractured, as I mentioned in my intro?
Well, one of the things that's interesting is that, in different parts of the world, democracy performs in different ways. And one of the things that I found in Africa is that although we would often talk about being disappointed in the performance of democracy, and, it is common now to say that democracy doesn't deliver, in general, most of the research we have actually shows 2 things. 1, most African people want to live in a democracy, and 2, countries that are more democratic in Africa actually tend to provide better quality services and do a little bit better on economic growth than their authoritarian counterparts. So maybe just an extra line on those 2 key points. If you're interested, if people who are listening are interested, you can go to the Afrobarometer website, afrobarometer.org. You can look up the figures for, almost any country in Africa. I think they've got 39 to 40 countries now up there. And you can see, and support for democracy as a system of government is pretty high. It's been dropping a little bit. People are frustrated, but it's still pretty high. And rejection of other systems of government, rejection of military rule or one-man rule or one-party rule is also pretty high. So, we should care about democracy because people in countries that we're interested in care about democracy. But also, as I say, I think sometimes people underestimate what democracy has achieved and overestimate, the performance of alternative systems. So people will often say to me, but look at Rwanda. Rwanda's doing well. Wouldn't it be better if everyone was Rwanda? And I remind them, well, we have one Rwanda. And we have a lot of other authoritarian systems in Africa that have never come close to Rwanda. And actually, what I would say is true of Africa, which is broadly true of most places around the world, is that you get a very small number of authoritarian regimes that perform particularly well. And often they'll outperform the average democratic system. They'll be up there. But the vast majority of authoritarian systems are not doing that. They're right down here at the bottom. And actually, most democracies are in the middle. And so, generally speaking, I think we need to remind ourselves that actually most authoritarian systems are not Rwanda, they're Zimbabwe, they're the Democratic Republic of Congo. They're actually systems that fail their citizens in terms of the provision of public services. And when we see it that way, I think it gives us lots of good reasons to persevere with democracy, even despite the challenges and the frustration so far.
And if we look at the Afrobarometer data, and you talked about it, it's beginning to taper out or maybe even drop a little bit in Africans' desire for democracy. Is this because we're asking, is it the way we frame the question? So here I'm thinking, if we went back to the mid-1990s and we asked the Chinese, what type of political system do you want? Do you want democracy or do you want communism? They probably choose democracy from the way it's defined. But it appears that a third way has appeared, which is this thing, call it whatever, with Chinese characteristics. Is it capitalism with Chinese characteristics or whatever the political system they're running with Chinese characteristics? Are we beginning to see some of that in Africa, i.e. what Rwanda is doing? Is he onto something? Yeah, I know if we take just the argument of liberal democracy, freedoms, etc., elections, is it also possible that what Kagame has touched on is an African way of arranging politics and arranging progress that we haven't studied well enough?
Oh, it's a good question. I personally, I'm not sure that it is. And the way I try and get people to think about this is to say, well, let's see what would be needed to replicate what Kagame has done in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Kenya, for example. So if we went to Nigeria right now, is there any way we could get political elites in different communities, both religious and ethnic, around a table to agree that one of them, who would have to be by definition from one of those communities and not others, would be the president for the next 20, 30 years? Could we agree on that? My suspicion is you wouldn't be able to find a way of getting people in Nigeria to agree on that, because one of the things that people like is the rotation of power between different groups. And actually, when that's flouted, there's a great public outcry. Similarly, in Kenya, people right now are very frustrated with President Ruto. There are mass demonstrations, youth-led demonstrations. If President Ruto were to say tomorrow, I'm going to go the Kagame way, we won't have competitive elections, I'm going to control things much more, I'm going to win 98% of the vote in the next election, is there any way Ruto could forge consensus on that and manage that? I don't think so. I think actually in a lot of these countries, to try and do what Kagame has done would involve extremely high levels of repression and probably trigger civil conflict and maybe civil war, because you simply don't have a leader who has the political control, authority, capacity to be able to exert that level of top-down control over the political system. And the attempt to do it would probably lead to different groups coming into conflict with one another. So this isn't to say that I think everywhere we see an authoritarian model that's working, we should pull it down. That's not my argument at all. If the Rwanda model works for development in Rwanda, there are good arguments for saying that, there might be developmental reasons for doing that. Although, of course, we also know that Kagame is responsible for significant human rights abuses. And we have to keep in mind that some of Rwanda's economic success has come because of smuggling from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So some of Rwanda's success has come from its exploitation of resources in other countries. But I'm not suggesting that we should go into or encourage every single country that's authoritarian and is performing well to become democratic overnight. It's rather to point out that I don't think the Rwanda model could be replicated in the vast majority of countries in Africa. And therefore, I think actually a more feasible approach is to try and evolve the system that's there already into something that's more robust, more effective, more independent. The other thing I think we have to keep in mind is that, most of the data, and we make this point in the book, most of the data we have shows us that the longer leaders are in power, the more corrupt, idiosyncratic they become. So it's one thing to think that a leader is fantastic. And so, yeah, let's remove term limits and have him for another 4 years. 15, 20 years down the line, you often start to regret that decision when he won't go at the age of 80, 90, and so on. In places like Cameroon, in places like Uganda, we have real concerns within even regime insiders about presidents for life and what's going to happen and the need for actual political rebirth, which is stopped by that happening. And I think that's one of the things, again, we have to keep in mind, that that one-party state model or that leader for life model with no term limits might look very good when a leader's performed well for a couple of terms. The problem with it is you then can't get rid of that leader even if they perform badly for 2 or 3 more terms. And I think people in countries like Chad and Cameroon would turn around and say to people in countries like Rwanda and Uganda, be careful what you wish for.
Mm. Interesting. So my question is, there was this whole great hope around the third wave of democratization in Africa, but we're beginning to see that taper out or even slow down. In your view, what are the factors that led to this? What are the factors that led to what you and Brian have coined quite perfectly as counterfeit democracies? What are the signs that lead to it, and what are the factors that conditioned it?
I think it's a couple of different things we need to put on the table. One, we know that a lot of countries didn't become full democracies in the first place. So it's not like the 1990s led to a set of really well-functioning democracies. We had some countries like Botswana and Mauritius that have been democratic in Africa since independence. We had a few countries in the early 1990s that made really good breakthroughs and became more democratic. But we also had countries in the early 1990s that kind of got stuck in a no man's land of transition without end, that didn't really become democratic, where leaders effectively allowed elections, but then sought to manipulate them very quickly, and where we never really saw opposition parties have a real opportunity to take power. And so one of the things we talk about in the book is the different strategies that leaders have used to manipulate elections and keep themselves in power, effectively instrumentalizing elections, right? Using elections to try and gain legitimacy, using elections to access international funds and to get international critics off their backs, but never actually being willing to lose, never really being willing to consider allowing a level playing field, and effectively consistently manipulating and winning elections that were flawed. So we've got that set of cases which were never democratic, and I don't think we've necessarily seen that much change in some of those countries. I think they're roughly where they were in the 1990s. What I do think we've seen is in some of the countries that had started to perhaps look a little bit better, we've started to see increasing concern in a number of areas. One of those is that we've seen growing media censorship and pressure on journalists over the last few years, particularly around COVID-19, when there was a sort of significant repression of human rights and free speech around the world as governments struggled to deal with COVID, but not just around that. We've also seen a lot of countries pass what is often called anti-NGO legislation or anti-civil society legislation. Of course, this isn't an African thing at all. This goes back to Russia and the foreign agent law, but this is legislation that's been passed in different ways around the world that has significantly weakened in a lot of countries civil society and its capacity to check governments. We've also seen, as we were talking about just a moment ago, a lot of countries remove presidential term limits, and so we've got leaders who are set on being presidents for life. And of course, one of the first things you can expect a leader who's set on being a president for life and has gone to the trouble of removing term limits to do is to manipulate the next elections, because you don't get rid of term limits and set yourself up as a president for life to hold a free and fair election and then accept defeat. So all of these trends have slightly eroded the capacity of societies and opposition leaders to be able to actually hold leaders accountable. And in that sense, Africa has seen some of the trends we've seen in the rest of the world. We have to remember that globally, we're in 20 years of authoritarian recession. We've seen around the world a decrease in the quality of democracy in supposed democracies like the United States. We've seen a decrease in the quality of democracy there. And we've also seen a lot of authoritarian countries get more authoritarian. You talked about China earlier, and it's interesting to think that, China had term limits. China had more checks and imbalances within power. Under President Xi, a lot of those things have been removed, and there's been a centralization of power under him. So in a sense, we could also say that there are signs of autocratization within China and within some authoritarian states. The one thing that we then need to say, and so I don't want this answer to be too long, but I think this is a really important point, is that we've also seen very different stories. We've seen Zambia, Malawi move towards democracy at precisely a point in the world where no other countries in the world did so. So during the COVID pandemic, Zambia and Malawi were the only two countries that most democracy ratings organizations said moved towards democracy. So here, Africa was actually leading the way in democratic breakthroughs. We've also seen in recent years, think about Nigeria 2015, Gambia 2016, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Senegal very recently, opposition parties winning elections in places where, we perhaps had thought they might not. Winning elections in some cases that weren't completely free and fair. Those kinds of opposition victories, I think, are an important reminder to us that there is still a struggle for democracy going on. And actually, there is still evidence of democratic life and in some cases, democratic progress in a lot of countries across the continent. So one of the things I always say to my students is the one thing you must never do if you want good marks in my course, is to talk about Africa as if it's the same place, right? As if there's African democracy or democracy in Africa, and it's the same. We actually see really different patterns. We see countries that are moving slowly towards democracy, countries that are cycling between different crises, some countries that are authoritarian and getting more authoritarian, and there is no one African experience when it comes to the experience of democracy.
Fantastic. And I really loved reading, how to rig an election. You use really poignant examples that brought the story to life, especially in explaining how the rigging works. So if you could help unpack that for, our participants on the different ways that elections are rigged across the continent and also across the world, especially the activities that happen pre-election day, that may have also already decided the voting even before the voting starts.
Absolutely, and we should always remember that the professionals and the experts we talk to in the book tell us that only amateurs rig elections on election day, right? If you're rigging an election on election day, you've got it wrong, because you should have been doing it a long time in advance. Why? Because, of course, rigging the election on election day is more controversial, more likely to risk violence, more likely to be seen by international observers, more likely to be reported by the media. So yes, if you're good at this, you plan your election manipulation many, many months in advance. If you wanted to give you a quick rundown of what you should be doing, well, first of all, you should be using gerrymandering. You should be trying to fix the boundaries of constituencies so your party gets more votes for the same seats. Of course, again, as you were saying, these are global strategies. The term gerrymandering originated in the United States. This was a classic strategy in US politics. And if you look today, there's still gerrymandering of districts and boundaries in the US today. So these issues are still significant. You use voter suppression. You try and stop your opponents' voters from getting on the voter register. Historically, of course, in the US, that was racial suppression, stopping black voters, and that's still a feature of US politics today. In the African context, that might be trying to stop voters, either urban voters, if they're more likely to support the opposition, like, say, Zimbabwe, or voters of a particular ethnicity that are likely to support the opposition, stopping them from getting on the electoral register. And these strategies are really effective because they happen well before the election. They're often things that don't get that much coverage in election media reporting. The other thing that's really effective, and we talk about this in the book with the case of Marco Ravalomanana in Madagascar, is not allowing your most effective opponents to stand. I mean, Brian wrote on Madagascar and went to interview people there, and one of the best examples is basically where in Madagascar you need to be able to hand in your election papers in person to stand, right? So you have to hand them in. No one else can do it on your behalf. So you've got an opposition candidate who's in exile who needs to hand in his papers, gets on a plane, flies to the country, thinks he's going to land, get out the airport, get in a taxi, go hand in his papers, and maybe, start campaigning or go back home. And no, because of course the president sees this coming, understands the law, doesn't want this candidate to be on the ballot paper. So what does he do? closes the airports. So you get these, strategies to effectively keep the most effective opposition leader off the ballot paper, sometimes claiming that the opposition candidate hasn't filled out the form properly, sometimes using trumped up criminal charges to claim that they're not eligible to stand, sometimes, like in the case of Madagascar, actually closing all the airports so the plane can't land. And of course, if you do all these things, if you pick your voters, so you can see boundaries, and you pick who your opponents are, then you could end up in a situation where you don't need to rig the election much in terms of violence or ballot box stuffing, because you've already set up a 20-30% advantage over anybody else. And then, of course, it's much more likely that international observers and international governments will say that the election was good, because it can look good on election day, because you don't need to manipulate at that stage. You've done it months and months in advance.
So in another book, the moral the moral economy,
Well, economy of elections, yeah,
of elections. You speak about you've got to be popular in a locale to be able to buy votes, right? But I think smart, corrupt politicians are also moving beyond that, where they're no longer bothering about buying votes, but buying the judicial system, so you have rigged elections, or you have elections that are not up to scratch, and they expect you to end up in court. And by the time you get to the court, they've already bought, even up to the Supreme Court. Have you spent some time looking at this? And where I'm going with this is there a way out? Because at the end of the day, it's beginning to look like, the people are stuck, with a system that you try to solve it here, and, the smart politicians come up with another strategy that, nullifies all the efforts that have been made in the past.
It's challenging, right? I mean, people are smart. Political leaders are smart. We often treat them as if they're not, but they're often quite innovative, quite cunning. And leaders learn from each other, right? So Democrats learn from each other, but authoritarians learn from each other, and sometimes learn quicker and faster. I talked a little bit earlier about the anti-civil society legislation that's been introduced. That legislation has very clearly been passed through different authoritarian networks, and different leaders have taken it on board, having seen how well it's worked in other countries. We could say the same about, strategies that have been used for digital monitoring and censoring digital communications, finding a way of, pushing back against social media and so on. It's constantly, I mean, Brian describes in the book like a game of whack-a-mole, that game you get in a sort of children's playground, where every time you knock one of them down, it comes up somewhere else. You're constantly playing this game every time. And I remember talking to an election observer who'd done a number of very difficult elections, and he said to me, we're always fixing the last election. Every time we get to an election, we fix the two things that were really wrong. But the government has moved on, right? They've got a completely new way of manipulating the next election. So we're always sort of trying to put out the fire from the last one. They're starting a completely different fire in a completely different place. And by the time we realize what's happening, it's too late to put it out. And then, so we're always playing catch up. So on that sense, I think we have to be aware that it's a constant challenge, and democracy is never consolidated. That's what we see with the problems that the UK and Germany and Austria and America are having right now. It's a constant battle to sustain and build and strengthen institutions. And if you stop fighting, actually, it's very easy to have erosion, even in countries that we assumed were pretty stable. But I do have some hope, and some, I do think there are the ways in which things have improved and got better. Let me give you one of the examples that I know best, because one of the countries that I've worked on for the longest time is Kenya, which is in the Moral Economy book. And I wrote my PhD on Kenya, and I've been going there and researching there for 20 years. I'd have told you that there was a Supreme Court in Kenya that in 2017 invalidated the election of the sitting president, and that a new election had to be held as a result of that. You would have said, "You're a fool, Cheeseman. You know nothing about politics. You know nothing about Africa. Get out of my podcast. Get out of my conversation." And that came about through very specific reasons, right? One of those reasons was that Kenya had a major political crisis, which made the political elite think again. The post-election fight crisis from the 2007 elections, the violence of 2007, 2008. There was a formation of a power-sharing government and a process with Kofi Annan and others involved around resetting and thinking about where the country would go. That involved questions about the new constitution. There was then bringing in internationals to try and mold a good constitutional draft. There was, I think, a sense within Kenya's political elite that they needed to re-legitimate the system, that this was an existential crisis. There was then, at the same time as that, the fact that President Kibaki, who was the president at the time, was standing down at the end of that time because term limits had been respected, and he was going to respect term limits. So that meant that he was in his second term. Perhaps he wasn't thinking about a third and a fourth term, so he could allow the constitution to take power away from the president to an extent. And so all of a sudden, we got a new set of political institutions in Kenya. And then on top of that, there was a process of judicial vetting, and that meant that the judiciary had more quality and was seen as being more legitimate in the eyes of Kenyans. We got, a Supreme Court elected, and then we've had a succession in the last few Chief Justices who've been willing to demonstrate their independence from the government. And all of a sudden, Kenya has a Supreme Court that sometimes makes decisions that displease the government. This in a country that we would have talked about maybe in the 80s as having pliant institutions dominated by President Moi with classic neo-patrimonial politics. So I think that shows us that there are ways in which things can change. Now, it's also true that lots of things haven't changed, right? Kenyan politics still involves corruption. There is still clientelism. There is still vote buying. There is still aspects of, so I'm not suggesting that everything has changed overnight, but those institutions and the institution of devolution have, I think, become embedded in Kenyan political society and culture in a way that it's fairly unthinkable now that someone would remove them. Again, decentralization hasn't been, all good. In some ways, people would argue that decentralization has devolved corruption and devolved mismanagement as much as it's enabled and empowered people at the bottom. But what's really interesting to me is that it's popular with citizens, it's popular with governors and senators, and it would be very hard for a central government now to get rid of decentralization tomorrow, just like it would be very hard to get rid of the Supreme Court. So, what I'm saying is we can see in Kenya how institutions taking measures that actually enable those institutions to be a bit more independent, then popular support for those institutions rising can create checks and balances on the executive that then leads to a very different political situation. And Kenya, of course, is in a situation where President Ruto, when he put the 2024 finance bill, which was going to raise taxes on a number of people and was very unpopular, faced mass protests. And one of the things that happened as a result of that was that Ruto sacked his cabinet and removed the finance bill. Now, a lot of Kenyans who are protesting would say that's not enough. That's a superficial treatment of a more deep-rooted problem. But it's nonetheless noticeable that Ruto was forced to take a step back, to remove the cabinet, to remove the finance bill. So I would say in a country like Kenya, I start to see real prospects, not that things are perfect now, but that if those institutions can survive and keep getting stronger over the next 20 years, we'll have seen something else happen in the next 20 years that was unthinkable today, just as having that Supreme Court today would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. And I think there's a few countries in Africa, where that's happening. So as much as, yes, we're playing a game of whack-a-mole, they're always one step ahead. There are really challenging processes. I think it's possible to build institutions and to strengthen them. And maybe a final word on this is it's interesting to me, how many countries term limits have become institutionalized in. Term limits are pretty institutionalized in Malawi, in Zambia, in Kenya, and so on. In all of these countries, what we're not going to see, touch wood, is presidents set themselves up as presidents for life. We're going to see presidents having to stand down, new leaders coming to power, and that's going to create the opportunity to hold those new leaders accountable, but also to have different leaders from different communities come through government. And I think in all of those ways, actually, there are reasons to be more optimistic. So overall, despite my deep concern for what's happening over the last few years, I remain optimistic about the longer term.
I don't know why I'm not as optimistic as you are. I think what we've done is that we're beginning to swap the presidents for life to an elite class for life. And what I mean by that is you've got presidents who control all the institutions that can get you to power, and they hand over to their hand-picked successors who continue just running down the economy and not driving any real development or progress. And because there's this veneer of democracy, elections, etc., the people don't even have anyone to complain to, because the international community would be like, but you had elections. But it's also obvious to everyone that the elections were rigged. So have we really moved, or, is it just a renaming of the same problem? Yes, we don't have presidents for life, but we have an elite class that holds on to power forever, and the masses can do little to nothing about it.
I think that's a great point. And I think the inequality in many African societies and the gap between the poor and the rich, and the way in which the rich sometimes serve as a self-serving elite that deliberately maintain economic and political systems that continue that inequality is, a major issue. I completely agree with you about that. And I think, that's where it's really interesting to think about, to what extent do we actually see genuine accountability and genuine changes? And I think there's two things that are important to think about there. One is, where do we see those structures from below that start to hold governments accountable, whether they're social movements or civil society groups and so on? And where do we see voters starting to push back more and trying to actually demand that accountability? And I think we do. If you look at young people, and especially young people in urban areas, you do start to see, for example, the expression and demand for a different kind of citizenship, which isn't based on charismatic leadership or ethnic affiliation, but is based on, the delivery of goods. You start to see, much more of a demand for a social contract in which governments have to perform for citizens in order to deserve the tax money of citizens and the compliance of citizens. And so I think, you're absolutely right, and I don't disagree, but here I'm also a little bit optimistic. So, what do I take from the Kenyan protests? The Kenyan protest didn't transform Kenya overnight into a more democratic or more egalitarian or less corrupt society. But what they demonstrated was the ability of tens, hundreds of thousands of young people to come together across ethnic lines, not simply being mobilized by an opposition party, not simply in Nairobi, but I think in something like 36, 37 counties out of 47 counties in urban areas, there were significant protests. So across a broad urban areas, we had significant protests from people who were explicitly campaigning on a cross-ethnic basis, demanding a different kind of politics, not just the repeal of the finance bill, but a different kind of politics to take Kenya forwards. And a lot of those demands have not been fulfilled by the Ruto government. But what gives me hope in that context is that that kind of political campaign, those kinds of alliances, which was explicitly about being Kenyan first and an ethnic group second, and explicitly about doing something that wasn't led from the top by a political party, but was something that was more organically done by citizens. Those are the kinds of things that we're going to need if we're going to transform societies and political systems in the way that you're talking about. Now, I think Kenya in some ways is in the slightly different place because it's historically had quite high levels of urbanization, reasonably high levels of education. So we've got a combination at the minute of, relatively high education interacting with urbanization, interacting with young people, and, that generating demands for greater accountability. And that might not be happening in the same way in other countries which have a much smaller urban population or much lower levels of education. And I think Kenya's also, of course, had, whether we count the Ruto transition as a genuine transition of government, it's had two transitions of government. So people perhaps believe that their vote and their actions can change politics in a way that maybe people in Rwanda or Zimbabwe or Uganda don't, because they've never seen the transfer of power at the ballot box. But I do think those kinds of social processes are the things that are going to be able to affect those kinds of politics that you're talking about. And so again, although I completely understand why you're more pessimistic, I think if we continue to build education and we continue to see urbanization and we continue to see the creation of these new forms of citizenship and these new demands, in 20, 30 years, we will see different forms of politics emerge. Now, I know that's not of great help to anybody right now. The idea that things might be better in 20, 30 years is very frustrating. I guess because I'm an academic and because I started working on this 20 years ago, and my project was actually, a study of Kenya and Zambia from about 1940 to 1995. It's that kind of, if we look in that longer term perspective, that's where I get my optimism from, not where we are right now.
Okay, so let me try something with you. I look at the NSAS demonstrations in Nigeria, young people. I look at the finance bill demonstrations in Kenya, young people. One got government to move Kenya. The one in Nigeria did not. Lots of kids killed, nothing came out of it. And I think, what's the key difference? And I hazard the guess that it's probably because of Kenya's history with the bad elections that led to, all the people that were killed, and nobody wanted to go back to that. But in the Nigeria case, the young people couldn't show or muster any credible threats. So the government knew it could put down the demonstrations and nothing would happen. If my thesis is correct, my hypothesis, if it's correct, then it is really that credible threat that gets government to move. And that takes me to the second part of my argument, which is every time I see this bad politics happening in Nigeria and around the continent, my fear is that we might be setting up for a return to military rule, because that is the only credible threat that could upset the democratic cart right now. If that's the case, aren't we just teetering on the precipice of this cliff? And how does one communicate to the political class that we should really just backtrack from where we are? And it's a difficult communication to have, because it's a collective action problem. It's not like it's dependent on one person to decide. So I'm a bit lost with that argument, and very interested in what you have to say.
No, I think you make a really good point. And yes, I mean, there's a lot of what you say, that I agree with. In terms of, why were the protests successful in Kenya and not in Nigeria? I also think there's perhaps other things going on there. I think electoral and political geography is important. Nigeria is such a big country with so many different political spaces. And it doesn't have, in the same way, a kind of focal point on a smaller number of urban areas. And I think that plays a little bit of a role in this. You have a separation of Abuja from, key areas of protests like Lagos and elsewhere, which of course you don't in Kenya. Nairobi is both the main center point of protests and the main center point of government. So I think there's a lot going on, but I also agree with you about what you say. We have, it seems to me, often quite complacent elites in Nigeria, given the extent of the security challenges, the extent to which Nigeria is teetering on the brink of state failure, as well as, democratic collapse. And you would think that that would be enough to shock Nigeria's political elite into more direct and concerted action. And yet we consistently see that it doesn't happen. I do think, the threat of military rule might be one of the factors that galvanizes people. I mean, of course, we saw recently in some of the protests, I think in northern Nigeria, some people waving Russian flags and some protesters talking about the need for a coup. So, that's something we have there. I wonder whether the government is a little bit complacent about the risk of a coup and doesn't think that that's a feasible outcome. Of course, it's also true in Nigeria that, at least older Nigerians appreciate what military rule was like. They know what life under military leaders was like, that it was often brutal, that it was often incompetent, that it was often corrupt. That it often didn't lead to economic growth. And so older Nigerians perhaps would be very careful about welcoming a return to those days. Younger Nigerians, of course, perhaps don't remember, were not alive at that stage, perhaps aren't as fully aware of what military rule was like. And I think this is one of the really interesting questions, that we have to answer. So I see in some of the questions and in the webinar chat, people are saying, should we have democracy? Should we go for something else? We need another strategy for more rapid development. But Africa has tried most of the other strategies. I mean, if you look at the 70s and 80s, most countries in Africa were either military regimes or they were one-party states, right? You had the Zambia, Malawi, Kenya, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, etc., were the one-party states, and then places like Nigeria had military rule and individual dictatorships and periods of conflict. And, if we look at the record from 1960 to 1990, none of these authoritarian systems was really effective. I mean, there's very few authoritarian systems that delivered economic growth. Look at Zambia in 1990. It was poorer than it was in 1960 under a one-party state. Nigeria squandered vast amounts of oil money under military rule. So I think one of the things we have to also keep coming back to is, what's the prospect for a better type of political system that's more authoritarian to actually work? And that shouldn't be just a kind of speculative question. It should be an empirical question. Let's go back and have a look and ask that question. And let's really think about that question and get the data on that question. And that data generally tells us that one-party states and military rule perform worse in Africa than democracy does, despite the fact that democracy is frustrating people. In terms of the question you specifically asked about the shock and what is required for that shock, I think, yes, I mean, people forget that in the Kenyan context, two things happened. One, there was a genuine concern that the country could spill over into broader civil conflict that would look more like a civil war because of the unprecedented geographical spread of the violence. But second, I remember John Githongo telling me, around the time, people remember him as Kenya's former kind of anti-corruption minister, who was the star of the book Our Turn to Eat by Michaela Wrong, that one of the things that had happened around that election was that young people who had been on the battle lines, who had been committing violence or defending their community against violence, would stop in the road the cars of the middle class and take a tax. And basically what the young people would say is, you need to give us money because you're hiding behind your nice car, your nice gate, your big security, your nice house. You're not on the front line. We're doing this for you. You're causing this. We're not, but we're the ones who are suffering. And John always said that process had actually terrified a lot of the middle class. They understood not only was this a process that we might not be able to control in terms of the conflict between different ethnic groups, but this might be a generational and a class conflict within communities of those who are on the front line starting to demand. And those two things together perhaps are the things that encourage people to be willing to support a new political system that actually, changed the balance of power in a significant way. So maybe going back to, the Nigerian context, it's going to have to be a combination of those two things. Perhaps the fear of the system being replaced with a coup, combined with that fear of that bottom-up pressure. Now, again, it doesn't, what I struggle to understand is why that has not already happened. Because you would think with what's happened with Boko Haram, with what's happened with Biafra, with what's happened, in general, with the level of criminality and the expansion of criminal networks and everything we've seen, including banditry and the way that that's reshaped the economy. You would think that would be enough. That should be enough to be a shock. And that's, to me, the big puzzle about Nigeria is that the political elite haven't been more responsive to that and haven't seen that as more of a threat. And I do worry, as you, I think, do, that that's going to lead to a situation where, more profound political decay is possible. And, I think we have a hope every time we see a new leader, when Buhari was elected now, with Tinubu, that every new leader might just be the one to get it, right? Buhari, the disciplinarian, maybe he'll change the system. Tinubu, well, he helped to fix Lagos. Maybe he's got some ideas for the national level. And every time it doesn't quite happen, which probably tells us, I guess, that the structural barriers to change are also really considerable. They're not just about the individual at the top. This is a massive infrastructure going all the way down. But it does make me much more concerned. And I should say that my optimism about democracy in general is not there, for all countries. I'm very worried about Ethiopia right now. I'm really worried about Sudan right now. I'm worried about Nigeria right now. So, I'm optimistic in general about the continent and a lot of the countries. But when it comes to some of the continent's biggest countries, and in some ways are most important because they shape what happens elsewhere, I think we have to be really worried. And one of the things I wrote about a couple of years ago that I think we really need to think about is that, South Africa, Ethiopia, and Nigeria have a recession. The impact on neighboring states on their GDP is quite significant because a lot of those states trade with and get benefits from and, send people to work in. And if we see those sort of more hegemonic states in each region collapse economically, or in the case of Ethiopia, Sudan, into civil conflict, in the case of Nigeria, into criminality and economic stagnation, the impact on the region is really great. And if we then have a really problematic impact on the region, one of the consequences of economic downturn is it encourages people to look for alternatives to democracy. So one of the things I'm really worried about is that those poorly performing or stagnating big countries will actually make it easier for people to advance authoritarian arguments in the next few years.
Fantastic. And just to say that we're going to open it up for audience questions in a little bit. Just type your questions in the Q&A tab, not the chat. I see a lot of conversations going on in the chat, but the questions should go in the Q&A. But just another question to you, Nic. I saw one of your works, where you showed that there's a bit of a disparity in the way democracy is progressing, between, say, the Southern Africa and Western Africa versus the rest of Africa. What has led to that positive disparity in our case, and are there lessons, for us and for the rest of Africa to learn from how some parts are progressing much faster than the rest?
Thanks. I might actually throw this open to your audience, who seem to be super smart and engaged. So I might ask them if they can explain it. Let me just explain the kind of broad pattern, and then we can see if we can explain why the patterns come about. So, one of the things you see if you look regionally, and people might argue that regionally isn't helpful, it's not a useful lens, but if we were to look regionally, we would see that historically, West and Southern Africa have done better on democracy on average, right? So if you get the democracy score you would give to every country in the region, average it, they do a bit better. In Southern Africa, of course, you've got, South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, are often rated as pretty high quality democracies. Zambia and Malawi reasonably performing. We've seen significant transfers of power multiple times in Zambia and Malawi. Obviously, then there are countries that are much less democratic and open. Mozambique, problematic elections happening right now, Angola and so on. But in general, there's quite a lot of democratic states there that give a reasonably high average. If we were to go to West Africa, we would see a similar thing. Again, lots of countries that are not doing so well, but think historically places like Ghana, Senegal, Benin were some of Africa's more leading democratic lights. So in that sense, historically, we've had more democracy in West Africa. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but it's glitching a bit, but I can hear you.
Sorry. Okay. So, in Southern Africa, if you think about, South Seas, West Africa has historically had some, Benin, Senegal, Ghana, maybe some of those are moving away now. Liberia has had transfers of power. The parts of the continent that historically have really not done so well have been East Africa and Central Africa. If you think about Eastern Africa, you've got Ethiopia, Rwanda, Burundi, Somalia, Djibouti, none of which have ever really been very close to being a democracy, then Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. So the average is pretty low. If we were to look at Central Africa, again, a lot of countries that have either experienced conflicts, places like Central African Republic, etc., and very few democracies. Now, there's a really interesting question about why is that the case? So there's a different set of explanations that there could be there. One could be that a lot of West African societies had more decentralized systems of authority before colonial government. So this could be a little bit of a story about that. Could be about how early democratic institutions were introduced. We know that democratic institutions were introduced much earlier into countries like Senegal and Ghana than they were into other parts of the continent. And maybe that early introduction of democratic forms of government made it easier to sustain a kind of democratic model later on. It's also possible that there are regional effects because of regional powers and regional bodies. So ECOWAS intervened in the Gambia to remove Jammeh from power, enabling a transfer of power. You could argue that, West Africa has had slightly more, conducive atmosphere and international relations for developing a democracy, as has Southern Africa, although SADC has often been, sitting on its hands in terms of promoting democracy regionally. But you could argue that those two environments have been more positive for creating a new democracy than Eastern or Central Africa, where most of your neighbors are not going to be democracies and where the regional body is not going to see democracy as being something that it wants to promote. But I'd like to, I think it would be really interesting to throw this open to your audience as well. Why did we see historically Southern Africa and West Africa being more democratic and Central and Eastern Africa being less democratic? Is it just luck? Is it a structural reason? Again, these are broad averages, right? So there are democratic and authoritarian countries in each of these regions, but on average, it is quite pronounced. So I'd be really interested in what people might think about that.
And I'm sure they're going to discuss that in the chat room as we continue the conversations. But we've got some questions, and I've got 3 questions from Alana Henry. I'm going to try and compress all of them into one. And it's really about democracy. Does democracy really work in Africa? Yes, we've got all these elections going on. You call these regimes counterfeit democracies. The question is, the fact that we've got elections, does it mean that we have democracy, right? And another question he attached to that is, what does true democracy mean? And can this be sustained in Africa? And then he adds on the back of that, what does democracy mean to the youth? Because we've talked about the youth. What does it really mean to them? The Afrobarometer data, does it pick up on what the youth really want? Or again, is this that binary discussion, liberal democracy or illiberal governments? If you present that to anyone, they probably choose liberal democracy, but is that really what they're saying?
So that's a great question. Let's start on the youth. The Afrobarometer tells us that the youth are slightly less supportive of democracy than older groups. So if you look at the youngest demographic, the Afrobarometer will interview and compare that to older citizens, one of the things you'll find is that the younger people are actually slightly more skeptical about democracy. I think there were good reasons for that. Young people have, particularly people who are coming to vote now, have had a really difficult few years economically. They were often the first people to be sacked during COVID. They're more likely to be unemployed. They've been hit very hard economically by higher food prices and fuel prices over the last couple of years. And in many cases, of course, they don't remember, as we were talking about before, they don't remember the problems that authoritarian government generated. They also may be people who are quite impatient because they want to have an opportunity. And one of the things you talked about, which I think is completely right, is about, an elite, taking opportunities for themselves. But we often forget that is also about age. There's a generational process. We do have some parliaments where we see very old presidents with very old parliaments with incredibly young populations. Uganda would be a case in point. And so I think it's understandable that young people in some parts of Africa have become frustrated. They're still, I should say, on average, more supportive of democracy than any other system, but they are clearly frustrated by it. And we should be worried that young people are less supportive of democracy than older citizens. What do people want? I wrote a piece on this, and I'll try and find it and put it in the chat so that people can go and look at it if they're interested. I mean, I think people in Africa, broadly speaking, are in favor of elections. They're in favor of being able to speak their minds. They're quite supportive of freedom of speech, and they're in favor of systems that allow for the rotation of power between different ethnic groups. What they're also in favor of, though, is people in society and government pulling together to deliver development and getting things done. They recognize that they need a boost in development. And so people often will say that they're very supportive of multi-party politics, but after elections, they want people to come together and support the government in pursuing a clear long-term development plan. So myself and my colleague Sashua Shashua kind of define this or call this a kind of form of consensual democracy. People do want elections, they do want political competition, but they don't want unfettered competition that gets in the way of promoting development. They want people to come back together at critical moments to pursue that long-term developmental vision. That's kind of where we see people, and young people fit into that in terms of the political systems that they would appreciate. One of the things that is worth keeping in mind is the trade-off democracy for, better economic growth or for a leader that would get things done. And there is in some societies, in South Africa, we saw this recently, support for the idea that it would be better to have a leader that gets things done than it would be to have strong checks and balance, right? So people sometimes are willing to trade off a bit. This year, their first flagship report of the year, and the report showed that actually the thing that really undermines people's confidence in democracy is not economically performing badly as a government. It's actually the government doing things bad on the political space, on the political sphere. In other words, they tried to correlate, let's look at what's happened in the economy the last 2 years and whether an individual is supportive of democracy. And that was less important than whether the individual thought the government had manipulated elections or had been corrupt or had failed to deliver politically. So one of the things that we're constantly reminded of is that, yes, people want development. Yes, people want to eat. Yes, people want order and, a good government that deals with crime and so on. But most people, most of the time, want that to be balanced against a government that is fair, a government that allows criticism, a government that is representative of the people and is directly elected. And one of the things I always say to people is, why do we think that Africans have to choose? Like, why do we set it up as an either or? Why do we say, oh, you can have democracy or you can have economic growth and jobs? Actually, probably the reality is the more democracy you get, the more jobs you're going to get, because it's democracy, in my opinion, that's actually going to generate the processes that is going to create that economic set of opportunities. For example, going back to what we can learn from history, which were the countries that grew the most? Was Botswana and Mauritius. What were the countries that had the worst? So again, I don't think it's necessary. I do think that it's about, and you've said this a number of times, which I think is absolutely right. It's about making sure that you have the kind of democracy that actually enables you as the population to determine what's happening, to actually shape who's in power and to actually push for the delivery of those things. Now, it's interesting to look at what the record of some of those governments have been. If we actually look, and people sometimes forget this, there's a number of countries in Africa that introduced free primary education after the introduction of multi-party elections in the 1990s, partly because it was one of the main campaign messages of opposition parties and was then taken on by ruling parties. So if you look at countries like Kenya, free primary education was partly a function of the reintroduction of multi-party politics. So again, I think sometimes people have this idea that if we had more authoritarian politics, it would become more efficient, it would work better. Actually, authoritarian politics in a lot of countries prevented the government from feeling any accountability, so it meant more corruption and actually the provision of fewer public services. But yes, I think you're absolutely right that we need to be careful in not sort of presenting people with a binary. And actually, what we should be saying to them is not, do you want liberal democracy or this terrible authoritarian alternative, but do you want an economic model and a political model that has democratic elements, but also delivers more equality, closes the gap between rich and poor, provides infrastructure and services. And where I would be very critical of, the international community is that I think too often the IMF and the World Bank, both in the 1980s, but also today, are focused on, economic growth plus good governance, rather than providing jobs, education, lifting people out of poverty and reducing inequality. They would say that they're not. They would say that those are major priorities. But I think if we look at what's happening right now in the way that we're managing debt and the way in which that's forcing governments to cut their budgets, we're at risk of reproducing some of the outcomes of the 1980s, where debt basically played out in a way that undermined public services, hurt the poorest citizens the most, exacerbated the gap between rich and poor. I think one of the things we should be learning from history is that actually that's part of the problem. That weakens democracy as well as impacting on poverty. And we should support countries to deal with the debt crisis in ways that avoid that.
And I think in your response, you've answered a few of the other questions, especially one from Joshua Ode. I'm going to combine the question from Chibike Mbahurike and Benedict Oko, because both of them are really around, are there any international mechanisms that can put pressure on African leaders, who go through these suboptimal elections? Are there international mechanisms to put them under pressure? And I think in answering that question is also to think about how the West may have also lost or is losing its moral authority on preaching democracy when we see what's playing out, especially in America, in the forthcoming elections. And on the back of that as well, maybe you can touch on international observers, which is a mechanism that was supposed to kind of say whether elections are credible or not. But we have seen that many of these international observers are also hamstrung, in their ability to say what they're really observing. So it appears to me that we don't have any international mechanisms to help put the politicians under pressure, but I'm really interested in what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think my one-line answer would be, the savior of democracy in Africa is not going to come from outside Africa, right? In almost all cases where democracy has been built effectively and sustainably, it's been built from within. There's two reasons why I think, we shouldn't place too much hope on outside forces. One, I just don't think in general that they've ever been that powerful. I think, as I say, I think it's building strong civil society coalitions, building strong institutions, and domestic factors that determine whether or not you're going to have democracy. Now, that's not to say that international factors can't be really important. They can be, of course. They can put pressure on, military regimes to hold civilian elections. They could put pressure on governments to reduce corruption. They can put pressure on governments not to commit human rights abuses. So they can be powerful and they can be important, but they are never going to be the answer to long-term, building stable democracies in Africa. That's particularly the case now, as you said, because many of them are having their own crises. America with Trump would not be a government that would care about promoting democracy abroad. But America wasn't that strong on promoting democracy abroad, even under Obama. So let's not think it's all about Trump. The UK is caught in a strange moment. I think the new Labour government, cares about democracy abroad, wants to promote, rights and so on, but is also very careful that it doesn't want to be seen as a colonizing power. It doesn't want to be seen to be replicating the mistake of forcing political systems on other countries. And so David Lammy and others in the Labour government are very clear that they don't want to kind of go back to simply exporting a model of government. So I think they're not entirely sure right now on exactly how they want to go about dealing with the question of democracy. And of course, other governments, the German government has its own problems with the rise of the far right and so on. So what we see, across the West, broadly understood, is, either a kind of disengagement from the idea of democracy promotion or rethinking that idea, or a set of domestic factors that stops them being as effective. And I think that's significant because, of course, if you're a leader of an authoritarian government, you probably think you can get away with a bit more than you used to. You probably think you can get some funding and support from Vladimir Putin or from China to offset some of the loss of support from the West. But you probably also think that the West isn't going to come in and make a massive fuss if you do a bit of election manipulation here and there. And let's look at, recent elections where we know there was some electoral manipulation. We know there was in Uganda. We know there was in Sierra Leone. Those governments are still in power, partly because international factors can't change domestic realities, but also because there wasn't necessarily as strong an international response as there might have been, in the early 1990s to those processes. So I don't think that the international community is going to be the savior. In some ways, I think that's a good thing and a good message, right? Democracy should be won by people for themselves. And I think people need to create their own democratic myths. They need to create their own democratic victories. The idea that democracy was supplied in Africa by the international community in the early 1990s, I think, was a flawed idea. Anyone who knows the history of their own country knows that people sacrificed their lives in the struggle for democracy, and that many people over many years had struggled for it. Think about the battle against apartheid in South Africa. This was not a victory that was simply supplied by the international community. But ultimately, you have to build democracy for yourself. And it's those building of democratic, achievements. In Zambia, what did people reflect on when they were thinking about whether or not they could get rid of President Lungu as an incompetent authoritarian leader? One of the things they were thinking about was not, is the Americans going to come in and save us, or are the Brits going to come in and save us? It was, in 1991, we voted out KK. right? And in 2011, we voted in Michael Sada, we voted at MMD, and we can do it again. We, as the people, can go to the ballot box and change this government. That democratic kind of memory of being able to change government and mobilizing and knowing it's possible, that was all from within Zambia, supported by the international community, but built within Zambia. And that's what you need, I think, to build strong democracy. So it has to come from within. On observers, I think observers do a very difficult job because going back to the whack-a-mole, right? Observers are facing very canny politicians who manipulate elections in multiple ways. And, let's face it, observers often turn up with a team of 50 or 60 people, right? So let's say you've got 50 or 60 people in the EU election observation mission, or in the AU one, or in the Carter Center one. Maybe, the biggest missions I've ever seen are probably about 140 people. So that's the biggest one. How many polling stations are there? Well, I think in Nigeria, there's 180,000 polling stations. In Kenya, there's about 45,000 polling stations. So, how many polling stations are you covering with your individuals? I think we have to be realistic about what international election observers can do. It's also the case that they're in a slightly tricky position. I mean, people forget that to be an observer, you have to be invited in. Right? You can't just go. You can't descend on Zimbabwe if Robert Mugabe or Mnangagwa doesn't want you. You have to be invited. And so there has to be a process where, I think what they say is what they can prove, can't nail down. And did so, the government would say, prove it, and then they wouldn't be able to prove it. They wouldn't have enough evidence. And so I think election observers often would be. So when I'm shouting, this election was rigged and we can see it, and civil society is shouting that, observers can't necessarily conclude that because they're worried about the consequences of saying something they can't completely pin down. So again, I don't think international observers are what's going to save democracy. They're important, and I wouldn't want them to go. I think we need to invest more in them and give them more funds, but they're not going to be the answer on their own. And that's where I would say, one of the things that, I think is more important in some ways is trying to strengthen that domestic civil society group that does the domestic observation. Because who is it, really in Ghana that monitors the elections? It's the domestic civil society organization that puts thousands of people into thousands of polling stations. And it's that domestic effort that's actually going to get into more polling stations. It's the domestic groups that are often a bit more critical than the international community, not always. So again, yes, observation is important, but let's not forget that actually in some ways the future of that should be domestic observers and monitors, not the international ones. Domestic ones are going to speak with more authority. They're going to be people who aren't going to be able to be marginalized or painted as colonizers or malicious outside forces. And building those processes from within, again, enables people to defend their own democracies rather than having to rely on an outside force to do that.
Fantastic. And just 2 weeks ago, my guest was Obeyemi Adamaleku of Enough is Enough, and she spent a lot of time just explaining what civil society can do, especially when you expand the civil society definition to include like religious organizations, traditional institutions, etc., beyond just the civil society organizations. But I have a question here from Chukwemeka Ekesiobi, who says, okay, so we understand what civil society can do, but how can I, as a citizen, help prevent rigging, especially in Nigeria, where pessimism against democracy is gaining currency? So from your study, have you seen where individuals, things that individuals have done, just to preserve the integrity of the electoral process?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing what individuals can do, right? And I would say one ingredient is an individual, a citizen who wants to change the world. There's a great quote by Margaret Mead who says, never give up hope and think that individuals are insignificant. It may be very hard for individuals to change the world, but it's the only thing that ever
That's my favorite quote, right? By the way.
Yeah. It's a good one. So I've murdered it as well. We should get the actual quote.
So it's never doubt that a small group of thoughtful and committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. My favorite quote.
There you go. Well done. You've said it much better. Well, thank you very much. Exactly. So there's a couple of things though that are in that, right? One is it's about the individuals that are committed, but it's also about the group and being able to connect. And I think that's where I would say, the interaction between individuals like yourself, Thanks for being here on the call. And, new technology. So one of the things we've seen really effectively in recent elections, where we've seen oppositions do well or governments struggle, where we've seen election rigging being exposed, is being actually people connecting on very simple apps on social media, very simple uses of technology to share evidence across different constituencies of malpractice, whether that's vote buying, evidence of ballot box stuffing, evidence of political violence and repression. And as soon as you get a few thousand individuals working on the same app, sharing data, we can generate the kind of evidence that actually can make it possible to demonstrate that an election was manipulated. And this can be really powerful. So just to give you an example, in the Zambian elections, President Lungu came out on the evening of the elections and stated that he thought that the elections had been manipulated by the opposition. And he called on the Electoral Commission to basically intervene. He said that the opposition had manipulated the elections using violence and that they'd won an unfair victory. That's what he implied in his letter. Now, of course, this wasn't true. How was the opposition, being in opposition, not controlling the security forces, going to bully everybody into vote for them? But it was an attempt by President Lungu to get out of election results that were very clearly, very early on, not going to go his way. What were the factors that stopped him? Well, one, the fact that everybody knew that urban areas had voted heavily for the opposition and there might be protests and unrest. Number two, domestic observers. Domestic observers had got out there and actually used technology to be able to capture what actually had been in the vote in different parts of the country and to capture the reality of what had happened and how peaceful and orderly it had been in different parts of the country, and then use technology to be able to communicate that back. And that demonstrated that actually not only had the opposition won, but they'd won a big majority. And not only did they have the results, but they had some of the election observation forms to prove it. And Lungu was effectively told that, right? Actually, Mr. President, the Election Commission has the results. They don't look good for you. The civil society groups have the results. They don't look good for you. Of course, those results also were then shared with the international community. They've got the results. They know they don't look good for you. There's actually the technology means that this has been done systematically, so it's credible. All of these things build towards President Lungu actually agreeing to stand down and recognize Hichilema, as the next president of Zambia. So yes, individuals can make a critical difference, but connect your efforts to others through the use of apps and technology. Collect that data through different individuals so that you can be more systematic, and that can really shape the way that people think about an election and the decisions that leaders make in an election.
Exactly. And in answering that question, you've also answered Okechukwu Nwanguma's question on how, what citizens can do under an authoritarian regime. But there's a question here from Victor Mark Onyebu, curious to find out your thoughts about democracy as a form of government in a country with relatively low mass literacy rates and high levels of inequality. It essentially leaves a vast majority of the populace vulnerable to being manipulated against their collective best interests. So I guess the question is, how does democracy work where you have very high illiteracy rates, high poverty, massive income inequality? Are we setting up ourselves up for failure, still hoping that democracy can deliver in that kind of situation?
It's a great question. I've been working a lot in South Sudan recently, right, which is a country which has literacy challenges, it has infrastructure challenges, it has capacity challenges, electricity challenges, all the challenges you can name. And it does become much more difficult to deliver effective democracy in that sort of context. And of course, in South Sudan, we've seen, supposed elections and election timetables consistently being postponed and deferred. So I don't take in any way lightly that challenge. At the same time, I think it's also important to be a little bit careful, assuming that voters who are not illiterate or not as well educated can't make good decisions. So Joel Barkan, who was a significant figure in my career, a good mentor, worked a lot on East Africa and Kenya and Tanzania. He did some surveys in the 1970s, and he was able to show that basically more people in countries like Kenya and Tanzania knew who their MP was and knew what their MP had done than people in the UK or the United States. Now, these people often had low levels of literacy. They're often poorly educated, but they knew who their MP was because their MP was particularly important in their lives in the context of a state that didn't deliver and often relied on MPs to be the sort of central point connecting to citizens. And they often had quite a lot of understanding of the role of the MP. They wouldn't necessarily describe that role as an educated person might, talking about the constitution and representation in parliament, but they did in terms of what they wanted that MP to do for them. So, you can have strong forms of accountability, strong ties of accountability, and strong citizens who know what they want, even in societies without high levels of education. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind. It is, of course, possible, though, that those kinds of societies might be more susceptible to certain kinds of disinformation. And particularly in a world in which we see disinformation being generated both within countries, but also internationally by foreign actors and others, that leaves those countries more vulnerable. So I think one of the things that we then need to try and do is think about how do we put that right. And that's where I think, trying to strengthen education is one of the most important things we can do. That raises the question, right, of what's the best way to do that? And some people respond to that by saying, well, we need an authoritarian government that can get things done, increase GDP, provide education, build a good state. And then after that, we'll have the citizens that we need to be able to move to democracy. The problem with that, as we've talked about a couple of times, is that authoritarian governments in Africa haven't tended to do that. They haven't tended to provide good education. They haven't tended to provide infrastructure or build the state. In fact, authoritarianism is correlated in Africa with state failure and poor quality governments. Actually, we talked about this earlier, the governments that have introduced free education have predominantly been democratic governments because they felt under pressure from citizens to do it. So why did we get free education in countries like Kenya? Because it was massively popular with the electorate, and so political parties committed to it after the return to multi-party politics. So again, I agree, it's an issue, it's something we need to deal with, but my sense would be that actually we're more likely to get education provided by high-performing democracies than we are by authoritarian states. And so even though it's a challenge, it probably doesn't really change what we need to do.
Exactly.
I should say that this, to me, this is an empirical conversation, not just a theoretical one. If we had really good performing authoritarian states across Africa that were delivering education and everything people wanted, I would shift my views. But at the minute, the only good performing authoritarian state I can see is Rwanda. And that's one out of a very big continent.
Which makes it an exception to the rule. But anyways, I have a question here from one of your former colleagues at University of Birmingham, Ndumokolo, who's now with us at Nextier as a partner. Is there really a moral economy of elections in Africa, considering the powerlessness of the voters and the outcomes of the elections? And he says the 2023 elections in Nigeria and the current local government elections in Nigeria are top of mind for him. So if the people are really powerless, where is that? How does that then work?
Thanks so much. It's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think when we say the moral economy of elections, well, right? Moral economy doesn't mean it's necessarily good. It means that there's a consistent process of kind of moral conversation and debates around elections. And one of the things that we found most interesting when we did our studies, and this speaks to the point about the powerlessness, is that actually it's not always the people who spend the most money and are the richest who win. And this goes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier. So of course they have a big advantage, right? We all know this. We know that to be successful in Nigeria or Kenya, South Africa as a politician, you need to spend millions of dollars, right? Millions of dollars on your campaign. If you want to be a governor, tens of millions of dollars. If you want to be a president, hundreds of million dollars at least. That's the price of entry. In some countries, you need to spend that amount of money just to get it through the primary, let alone to be able to stand. Elections are an incredibly expensive thing. And that does create inequalities, and it does lock out poorer voters. And it probably locks out lots of women as well, because women are less likely to have that kind of money and to be part of those kind of networks. So again, I completely recognize those challenges. What was interesting to us in the book, though, was that we found lots of different places where the richest people didn't win. So Alan Cash is a good example. I mean, Cash was a figure in Ghanaian politics who was known, for being money bags, for handing out cash, for being a candidate who could give people money, and yet failed consistently to become elected as a political leader of the party or the country, because people didn't think it was authentic. They didn't see it as being credible. They didn't like the way the money had been achieved. They didn't think he was the right kind of leader for the country. And so despite spending the most money, he didn't win. We also have people, so this was a book that was a study of Uganda, Ghana, and Kenya. And, one of the things that we consistently found is that constituents who felt that someone was giving them money, but that money had been stolen, or that money was somehow given to that politician by someone who was corrupt and problematic, like a military figure known to have committed human rights abuses, that actually they didn't feel that that money that was given to them, as it were, had moral value. It didn't have authority. They felt that they could take that money and vote for anybody. So, for example, let's go back to the 2011 election in Zambia when, the government outspent the opposition probably 10, 15 to 1. This was an election where if money talks, the government should have won it. You could see 10, 15 ruling party posters to one opposition poster. And yet the opposition won comfortably. Why? Partly because the opposition ran a campaign called Don't Kubeba, right? The vice president, the deputy leader of the party, Guy Scott, actually said to a rally in mixture of English and Bemba, don't Kubeba, don't tell them, right? Take their money, vote for us. And they won. We saw a similar thing being done in Namibia, right? Eat DTA, vote SWAPO, right? Take the money of one party, vote for another. So a lot of the time we actually see people taking the money of a party, but rejecting the idea that that has authority over them or it's legitimate, believing that actually the way that that money has been generated means that that doesn't cast a kind of claim on their vote and voting with their conscience. And that means that sometimes the people who spend the most money don't win. And one of the things that I've done in elections is actually to go around interviewing the people who have lost. And in quite a lot of the cases I've gone around, I've interviewed people who've mortgaged their houses, who spent more money than other candidates and can't understand how they lost the election having spent so much. It's actually one of the tragedies we often forget about African elections is how many candidates go bankrupt and lose money from contesting. So I do agree with what you're saying in the question, but I also think there is a kind of moral economy there. And you have to both deliver development and money to your constituents, but you have to be seen to do so credibly and legitimately. And what does that mean? To be authentic generally means to physically go back to the constituency. If you go to Nairobi or you go to Abuja and you're never seen in the constituency for 4 years, you will not win the next election, no matter what you spend in that election. So it's about being accessible. It's about being in the constituency. It's about being seen to be true to the constituency's values and not selling the constituency out to another ethnic group or to another leader. It's about delivering on the key development things that the constituency expects. It's about going to funerals and weddings and being generous. All of these things constitute the demands that citizens have of their leaders. And if you flout that, if you don't do that, you will often find yourself booted out of the next election, even if you spent the most money. So yes, I think there is a moral economy of elections, but it's not always, a good one. But it is one in which leaders have certain things that they need to deal with. And one of the things that we found that was most interesting, I think, is that, a lot of voters would say to us, I'm going to take the money, but I don't really want to. I'd rather leaders didn't give us money, but I'll take the money, but I'm voting with my conscience. And one of the things that strikes me is that if we get to a point where enough people are willing to do that, leaders will start to figure out that it's probably not worth handing out this money, right? That actually handing out the money is very expensive and a lot of people are not voting for them. And maybe that's the beginnings of, getting vote buying under control. If you look at the UK and US, vote buying partly was removed by changes in parliament, changes in legislation to make it more difficult. But a lot of the issue was that citizens started to reject it, partly because standards of living were rising. And so the small amounts that were being offered weren't enough to actually sway people. So again, going back to long-term optimism, short-term pessimism, the situation is really bad. I think it's true that about 67% of elections feature significant vote buying in Africa, which is the highest percentage around the world. But if we expect economic growth to continue, we expect standards of living to continue and poverty to decrease, it should become harder to buy votes over time, and that should create more space for other kinds of politics.
Well, the argument about take the money and vote your conscience, does it really work? I did some local election observing in 2018, in Nigeria, in a state in Nigeria. And I saw that many of the people I spoke to after they left they voted, they collected money and voted. They basically voted for the same person that gave them the money. And their argument was they couldn't tell a difference between the candidates because they didn't know any of these candidates. And many of the candidates they just saw on TV, they couldn't tell one from the other. So doesn't it still come back to the person who gives the vote wins in a situation where the voter cannot quite differentiate between the different candidates?
It's a good point. It certainly doesn't always happen, right? I mean, people do all sorts of different things. Some people get bought and sell their votes. Some people vote a certain way because they think that only a leader of a certain ethnic group is going to be able to defend them and look after their interests. Some people vote against their interests, and some people sacrifice and vote, the way that they think they should. I think it's really complicated, and I think this often changes through an election. A colleague of mine, Dominic Burbidge, got his friends in Kenya to write a diary of their experiences in the election. And one of the things that you see is these people starting, this is in the 2013 elections, starting by saying, well, I'm not going to vote for this guy because he's my ethnic leader, because he didn't do the right thing. He's up on charges of human rights abuses at the International Criminal Court. I'm not going to vote for him. I'm going to do my duty as a good citizen of Kenya. And then as the campaign heats up and as it becomes more aggressive, and as they feel their community is more under threat, and as the money starts to be handed around, it becomes harder and harder for them to stick to that initial position. And there's a really nice moment where one of them writes in the diary, which became the title of the article, something like, get me out of this middle class hell. I don't want to vote for this guy, but I'm worried that if I don't vote for him, I'll be disadvantaged. My community will isolate me. People will, accuse me of betraying the community. And so you get the sense in the end of the article that a lot of these people voted for the candidate they said at the beginning that they weren't going to. So I agree with you, and I think it's really complicated. And certainly a lot of people do vote for the people, who bribe them or who are of their ethnic group. But I think, again, one of the things that I'm really interested in is how that's changing. Now, we'll see at the next election in Kenya whether that urban protest, that cross-ethnic urban protest that was explicitly about citizenship and holding the government to account across ethnic lines, we'll see at the next election in Kenya whether that translates into people voting a slightly different way and campaigns being a slightly different way. I might be naively optimistic to hope that some of this will carry over into that and we'll start to see a shift. But again, going back to what I was saying earlier, I think if we do, that will be a 20-year shift, right? It's not going to happen overnight. So my hope is that we see aspects of that and that will strengthen. But I totally, accept your point that it's not something that we see everywhere and that we see all sorts of other forms of politics. The other thing I would say, to be fair, is that, I've slightly cherry picked, and that when I've been optimistic, I've been giving you examples from countries that have more democratic politics, more turnover, perhaps less repressive, countries like Kenya, Ghana, Zambia, etc., which are countries that we know have had more positive democratic experiences despite some challenges. It is also true that people will probably make different decisions when they feel, that they're extremely repressed, they're very vulnerable, they're very unsafe. And when they think that the whole election is going to be rigged anyway, so why bother to take the risk of voting for a good candidate if, the government's going to rig it? So if you're in a country where the president wins 98% of the votes and the same people are consistently returned to parliament, I think that creates a very different environment in which to come to that decision of how to vote.
And we're now down to the last 2 minutes of this great conversation, but I wanted to get maybe one or two more questions in, and unfortunately we can't answer more than 18 other questions in the Q&A. But have you seen from your experience where any African country has made progress on election finance reforms? And if yes, what was the nature of that program and how did it work?
This is a great question. We see a little bit of progress, I think. We see some countries that have introduced legislation that stipulates that accounts should be published. We see, for example, countries in which the state provides finance for political parties. So there are quite a few countries in Africa where the state provides some finance. And in those countries in particular, there's often a requirement on parties that accept state finance to then publish accounts on how that money was spent. Now, that's a good thing in principle. It's good to have that legislation on the books. Of course, the problem is that it's rarely actually enforced. Accountability is quite weak. We don't tend to see really good accounts being published. The accounts don't really seem to match up to what we know was spent. And there's no real enforcement mechanism. Neither the police nor the registrar of parties nor the Electoral Commission seems to really take that and enforce it and check it. So at the minute, no, we see a fairly weak situation across the continent. Some places with very little regulation, some places with good regulation, but it's not really being enforced. There's not many places where we really see vote buying, and improper use of election funds, whether that's taking money from countries abroad or whether that's, spending money on things that they shouldn't be spent on. It's quite, rare to see those things being prosecuted. So I think that is one of the next big frontiers. I think it's one of the toughest things to actually deal with. And the reason why it's one of the toughest things to deal with is that the opposition also doesn't want it to happen. So it's not just that the government doesn't want these things to happen. It's often the opposition, because the opposition is often getting money from different sources it doesn't want to disclose, spending it on things it doesn't want to have to tell us about. And therefore, I've actually seen in some countries where civil society is pushing a piece of legislation and both the opposition and ruling party have colluded to stop it coming to pass. So I think this is probably one of the areas in which I'm least optimistic. And I think, again, it's one of the areas where we realize the difficulty of kind of trying to legislate your way out of trouble, right? The legislation is only going to be effective if you've got judges and if you've got civil society groups who are going to force it to be effective. And so, my sense here is that legislating our way out of that is not going to be the answer. The answer is probably going to be that actually societal change, rising standards of living are going to be the answer. But again, that's going to be 20, 30 years' time. So I don't think we're going to see financially clean elections, sadly, in the next decade.
We've totally run out of time, but I want to give you maybe another minute. Maybe there's something, a question I should have asked that I didn't, that you want to speak on.
Not at all. I've enjoyed this more than any conversation I've had in the last 3 or 4 months. So it's been a great conversation. I think great questions. Thank you to everyone in the chat. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed, learning from you and the experience. Of course, because you have fantastic former students of mine, that I knew it was going to be a good conversation, but it's exceeded all my expectations. The only thing just to say to people is that if people are interested and want to get more debate and want to join the debate, if people are interested in writing, the democracyinafrica.org, or follow me on LinkedIn. We've recently got a situation where we've teamed up with The Continent magazine, which is a magazine originally out of the Mail and Guardian, which is an award-winning magazine. And we're looking for people who have great ideas from Africa, researchers, early career researchers, journalists who want to write. And we can actually, for The Continent, we can actually pay money. And we're particularly interested right now in people writing about social movements and youth and protests, the kind of things we've seen in Kenya and Nigeria and Uganda recently. So if anybody's interested in, getting published and writing and getting engaged, check out Democracy in Africa, check out The Continent, send me an email, and it would be lovely to, to engage with some of you more over that mechanism. But thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And to everyone who joined, thanks a lot. We're really excited about our next 2 speakers. On November 6th, we're going to have former 2-time Minister Shamsuddin Usman, who just launched a book recently, Public Policy and Agent Interests. And on November 20th, we're going to have Professor Richard Joseph on prebendalism and a future foretold. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Nic. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Well, I'll be there for Richard Joseph. Excellent. That'll be a great one. Take care, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you.